The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly along the stone pathways. His small hands were clasped behind his back, a habit he had picked up from watching his father during official ceremonies. The young prince had always been observant, noticing things that others might overlook. But today something felt different in the air. Captain James Morrison had been George's personal protection officer for 3 years now. A tall, sturdy man in his early 40s with kind gray eyes and a gentle smile, Morrison had become more than just a guard to the young prince. He was a friend, a confidant, and sometimes even a father figure when Prince William was away on royal duties. Morrison had served in the military for 15 years before joining the Royal Protection Unit, and his dedication to the royal family was unwavering. George had noticed subtle changes in Morrison's behavior over the past few weeks. The man who once stood tall and alert now seemed to carry a weight on his shoulders. His usually bright eyes appeared clouded with worry, and sometimes George caught him staring off into the distance with a troubled expression. The prince had also observed Morrison rubbing his left shoulder frequently, wincing slightly when he thought no one was looking. During their daily walks through the palace grounds, Morrison's pace had become slower, more measured. He would pause more often, claiming he wanted to show George interesting flowers or architectural details, but the young prince suspected there was more to these frequent stops. Morrison's uniform, always impeccably pressed and fitted, now seemed to hang slightly loose on his frame, suggesting he had lost weight. The relationship between George and Morrison had developed naturally over the years. Unlike some protection officers who maintained strict professional boundaries, Morrison had a warm, approachable nature that appealed to the young prince. He would tell George stories about his own childhood in Yorkshire, share interesting facts about the places they visited, and even help with homework when George was struggling with particularly difficult math problems. Morrison had been there during some of George's most important moments. He had stood guard during the prince's first day at school, providing a reassuring presence when George felt nervous about meeting new classmates. He had been there during family celebrations, royal events, and quiet private moments alike. The consistency of his presence had given George a sense of security and stability in a world that often felt overwhelming with its protocols and expectations. The other palace staff had also begun to notice changes in Morrison. Mary, the head housekeeper who had worked at the palace for over 20 years, mentioned to her colleagues that Morrison seemed more tired than usual. She had observed him taking longer breaks and noticed that he sometimes struggled to keep up with the physical demands of his job. The palace doctor had discreetly suggested that Morrison might benefit from a medical evaluation, but the proud man had politely declined, insisting he was fine. George's parents, Prince William and Catherine, had also become aware of Morrison's situation. They had noticed his dedication never wavered, but his physical capabilities seemed to be declining. William, having served in the military himself, recognized the signs of someone pushing through pain and exhaustion out of duty and loyalty. Catherine had observed Morrison's interactions with George and could see the genuine affection between them, which made the situation even more delicate. The young prince had inherited his mother's emotional intelligence and his father's sense of responsibility. Even at his young age, George understood that the people who worked for his family were more than just employees. They were part of an extended family that kept their world functioning smoothly. He had been taught to treat everyone with respect and kindness, regardless of their position or title. On this particular morning, George had woken up earlier than usual. He had been thinking about Morrison's condition for several days, and a plan had begun to form in his mind. It was not a grand or dramatic plan, but rather a simple, heartfelt gesture that he hoped would make a difference. The young prince understood that sometimes the most powerful actions were the quietest ones. As George continued his walk through the gardens, he thought about the conversations he had overheard between his parents. They had been discussing Morrison's situation in hushed tones, clearly concerned about his well-being, but also worried about how any changes might affect George. The prince had pretended not to listen, but his sharp ears had caught enough to understand that Morrison was facing some serious health challenges. The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass. George paused by the fountain in the center of the garden, watching the water cascade down the ornate stone structure. This had always been one of his favorite spots in the palace grounds. a place where he could think and reflect away from the constant activity of palace life. Morrison approached from behind, his footsteps softer than they used to be on the gravel path. George didn't turn around immediately, instead continuing to watch the fountain while formulating his thoughts. He knew that what he was about to do would require careful consideration and gentle handling. The young prince had learned from his parents that leadership sometimes meant making difficult decisions with compassion and wisdom. The bond between the 10-year-old prince and his protection officer represented something beautiful about human connection that transcended social boundaries and official roles. Morrison had never treated George like just another assignment or duty to fulfill. Instead, he had approached his role with genuine care and investment in the young prince's well-being and development. This authentic relationship had created a foundation of trust and mutual respect that would soon be tested in an unexpected way. George turned slowly to face Morrison, studying the man's face with the careful attention of someone wise beyond his years. The prince had made his decision, and now it was time to act on it with the grace and thoughtfulness that his position demanded. George looked up at Morrison with those thoughtful blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom far beyond his 10 years. The captain stood at attention, as was protocol, but George could see the effort it took for him to maintain his usual straight posture. The young prince had been observing Morrison carefully for weeks now, and today he had decided to take action. "Captain Morrison," George said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that came naturally to him despite his young age. "Would you mind sitting with me for a moment? I'd like to talk with you about something important." Morrison looked surprised by the request. In all his years of service, protocol dictated that he remain standing while the prince was present, ready to respond to any situation that might arise. However, there was something in George's tone that suggested this was not an ordinary request, and the kindness in the young prince's eyes made it impossible to refuse. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," Morrison replied, carefully lowering himself onto the stone bench beside the fountain. George noticed the slight grimace that crossed Morrison's face as he sat down, confirming the prince's suspicions about his guard's physical discomfort. George settled beside Morrison, maintaining a comfortable distance while creating an atmosphere of friendly conversation, rather than formal protocol. The young prince had learned from watching his parents that sometimes the most important conversations happened in moments like these, when formality gave way to genuine human connection. "I've been thinking about something lately," George began, his voice thoughtful and measured. "You've been with me for 3 years now, and in that time you've become more than just my protection officer. You've been a friend, a teacher, and someone I truly care about." Morrison felt a warmth spread through his chest at the young prince's words. He had always maintained professional boundaries, but over the years, his affection for George had grown beyond mere duty. The boy was intelligent, kind, and surprisingly mature for his age. Working with him had been one of the most rewarding experiences of Morrison's career. "It has been my honor to serve you and your family, Your Royal Highness," Morrison replied, his voice thick with emotion. "These 3 years have been the best of my career." George nodded, then turned to face Morrison more directly. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. I know you've been having some health problems lately. I've seen you wincing when you think no one is looking, and I've noticed that you seem tired and in pain sometimes." Morrison's eyes widened in surprise. He had tried so hard to hide his struggles, not wanting to worry the young prince or appear unable to perform his duties. The fact that George had noticed demonstrated not only the boy's perceptiveness, but also his genuine concern for others. "I appreciate your concern, Your Royal Highness, but I assure you that I am perfectly capable of continuing my duties," Morrison said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. George smiled gently, a smile that reminded Morrison of Princess Catherine's warm and understanding nature. "Captain Morrison, you don't have to pretend with me. I may be young, but I'm not blind. I can see that you're hurting, and it breaks my heart to watch you suffer because you feel you have to be strong for me." The directness and compassion in George's words caught Morrison off guard. He had expected many things from his years of service, but he had never anticipated having such a mature and heartfelt conversation with a 10-year-old prince. The boy's emotional intelligence was remarkable, and Morrison found himself moved by the genuine care in George's voice. "I've been thinking about this for several weeks now," George continued, "and I've come to a decision that I hope you'll understand. I want you to know that it comes from a place of love and respect, not from any dissatisfaction with your service." Morrison felt his heart beginning to race. He had a growing sense of what was coming, and part of him was both relieved and terrified. He had been struggling with his health for months, but his loyalty to the royal family and his affection for George had made it impossible for him to consider stepping down voluntarily. "I want you to resign from your position," George said quietly, his words gentle but firm, "not because you've done anything wrong and not because I don't want you around anymore. I want you to resign because I care about you, and I can see that this job is causing you physical harm." The words hung in the air between them, and Morrison felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. There was relief that his struggles had been acknowledged, gratitude for the young prince's compassion, and sadness at the thought of leaving his post. But overwhelmingly, he felt moved by the maturity and kindness that George was showing. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison began, his voice wavering slightly, "I don't know what to say. My duty is to protect you, and I would never want to abandon that responsibility." George reached out and gently placed his small hand on Morrison's arm, a gesture that spoke volumes about the relationship they had built over the years. "You're not abandoning anything, Captain Morrison. You've given 3 years of your life to keeping me safe, and you've done it with such dedication and care. But now I need you to take care of yourself." The young prince paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "I've learned from my parents that true leadership sometimes means making difficult decisions for the good of the people you care about. This is my decision, Captain Morrison, and I'm making it because I want you to be healthy and happy." Morrison felt tears forming in his eyes as he looked at the remarkable young man sitting beside him. In all his years of military service and royal protection, he had never encountered such wisdom and compassion from someone so young. George's words had cut straight to the heart of the matter, acknowledging both Morrison's dedication and his need for rest and recovery. "I want you to know," George added softly, "that this doesn't mean goodbye forever. You'll always be part of our family, Captain Morrison. I just want you to be part of our family as someone who is healthy and not in pain every day." The fountain continued to bubble gently beside them as Morrison struggled to find the right words to respond to such an extraordinary gesture of kindness from the young prince he had grown to love like a son. Morrison sat in stunned silence for several moments, overwhelmed by the depth of compassion and maturity that George had just displayed. The captain had spent his entire adult life in service to others, first in the military and then with the royal family, but he had never experienced anything quite like this moment. A 10-year-old boy had just demonstrated more leadership and emotional intelligence than many adults Morrison had encountered throughout his career. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion, "I am deeply moved by your words and your concern for my well-being. You have shown me a kindness that I will never forget." George could see the struggle playing out on Morrison's face. The captain was a proud man who had dedicated his life to service, and accepting help or admitting weakness went against every instinct he had developed over the years. The young prince understood this internal conflict because he had seen similar struggles in his father, when difficult decisions needed to be made for the greater good. "I know this is hard for you," George said gently. "I know that your whole life has been about putting others first and never giving up, but sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit when they need help or when it's time to step back." Morrison looked out across the palace gardens, remembering all the walks he had taken with George over the past 3 years. They had explored every corner of these grounds together, sharing stories, laughing at jokes, and building a friendship that transcended their official roles. The thought of leaving all of this behind was painful, but he could no longer deny that his body was failing him. "I have been struggling," Morrison admitted quietly. "More than I've let anyone know. My left shoulder has been causing me constant pain for months now, and I've been having trouble sleeping because of it. Some mornings I can barely lift my arm, and I've been taking pain medication just to get through the day." George listened carefully, his young face showing genuine concern and understanding. He had suspected that Morrison's problems were serious, but hearing the details made his heart ache for the man who had been such an important part of his life. "The doctors think it might be related to an old injury from my military service," Morrison continued. It's been getting progressively worse, and they've recommended surgery followed by several months of physical therapy. I've been putting it off because I didn't want to leave my post, but I know I can't continue like this much longer." The honesty in Morrison's voice confirmed everything that George had suspected. The young prince felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that Morrison had been suffering in silence, but relief that his decision to speak up had been the right one. "Captain Morrison," George said, his voice filled with quiet authority, "I want you to promise me something. I want you to promise that you'll take care of yourself the way you've taken care of me all these years. You've taught me so much about duty and service, but you've also taught me about kindness and loyalty. Now I want you to show those same qualities to yourself." Morrison turned to look at George, seeing not just the young boy he had been protecting, but a future king who was already showing the wisdom and compassion that would serve him well in years to come. The captain realized that this conversation was as much about George's growth as a leader as it was about his own health concerns. "I've been thinking about what I would say to you when this moment came," Morrison said. "I've practiced speeches in my head about duty and responsibility and staying at my post no matter what. But sitting here with you now, listening to your words, I realize that you've already grown into someone who doesn't need those lessons anymore. You've learned them so well that you're now teaching them to me." George smiled, an expression that lit up his entire face and reminded Morrison of all the joyful moments they had shared together. "You taught me that protecting someone sometimes means making hard choices. Today I'm making a hard choice to protect you." The two sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the fountain and listening to the sounds of the palace gardens around them. Birds chirped in the nearby trees, and the distant sound of groundskeepers working could be heard from across the lawn. It was a peaceful moment that both would remember for the rest of their lives. "There's something else I want to ask you," George said eventually. "When you're feeling better after your surgery and recovery, would you consider coming to visit sometimes? Maybe you could help train my new protection officer, or just come for tea and tell me about how you're doing." Morrison felt his eyes filling with tears again at the young prince's thoughtfulness. Even in the midst of making the difficult decision to ask for his resignation, George was thinking about maintaining their friendship and ensuring that Morrison didn't feel abandoned or forgotten. "I would be honored to visit, Your Royal Highness," Morrison replied. "Nothing would make me happier than to see you growing up and becoming the remarkable leader I know you're going to be." George reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I have something for you," he said, offering it to Morrison. "I asked my mother to help me choose it, but the decision was mine." Morrison accepted the package with trembling hands, carefully unwrapping the elegant paper to reveal a beautiful silver pocket watch. Engraved on the back were the words, "To Captain Morrison, with gratitude and friendship. Prince George. I wanted you to have something that would remind you of our time together," George explained. "And I thought a watch was appropriate because you've given me so much of your time over the years." Morrison held the watch carefully, overcome with emotion at the thoughtfulness of the gift. It was clear that George had put considerable thought into choosing something meaningful, and the personal engraving made it even more special. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the most thoughtful gift I have ever received. I will treasure it always." The news of Captain Morrison's resignation spread quietly through the palace staff over the following days. Word traveled in hushed conversations between housekeepers, groundskeepers, and other security personnel, all of whom had come to respect and admire the dedicated protection officer during his 3 years of service. However, what surprised everyone was not that Morrison was leaving, but the circumstances surrounding his departure. Mary, the head housekeeper, was the first to learn the full story from Catherine herself. The Princess of Wales had been so moved by George's actions that she felt compelled to share the story with someone she trusted. As Mary listened to the account of the conversation between George and Morrison, she found herself wiping away tears with her apron. "That young prince has such a good heart," Mary said to Catherine as they stood in the palace kitchen. "To think that a 10-year-old boy could show such wisdom and compassion. Captain Morrison must have been so touched." Catherine nodded, her own eyes bright with pride for her son. George has always been perceptive, but this showed a level of maturity that honestly surprised even us. William and I had been discussing Morrison's situation for weeks, trying to figure out the best way to handle it without hurting anyone's feelings or making Morrison feel like we were pushing him out. The conversation between George and Morrison had indeed solved a problem that had been weighing heavily on the minds of the Prince and Princess of Wales. They had both noticed Morrison's declining health and had been concerned about his ability to effectively protect their son, but they had also been acutely aware of the man's pride and dedication. Finding a way to address the situation without damaging Morrison's dignity had seemed nearly impossible until George had taken matters into his own hands. William had been particularly impressed by his son's approach to the situation. As someone who had served in the military himself, the Prince of Wales understood the mindset of men like Morrison, honorable, dedicated individuals who would rather endure personal hardship than abandon their duty. George's ability to frame the resignation as an act of care rather than dismissal had been nothing short of brilliant. Over the next few days, George made several visits to Morrison's quarters to check on him and help him prepare for his departure. The young prince brought books, played card games, and simply spent time talking with the man who had become such an important part of his life. These visits meant everything to Morrison, who had been worried that once he resigned, he would be forgotten by the royal family he had served so faithfully. During one of these visits, George brought along a photo album that he had been working on with his mother's help. The album contained pictures from Morrison's 3 years of service, photos from official events, candid shots from their daily walks, and images from various royal engagements where Morrison had been present. Each photo was accompanied by a handwritten note from George, describing what he remembered about that particular day. "I wanted you to have something that showed all the wonderful times we've shared," George explained as Morrison flipped through the pages of the album. "My mother helped me organize it, but I wrote all the notes myself. I wanted you to know that I remember everything we've done together." Morrison was deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. The album contained memories he had forgotten, moments that George had obviously cherished and remembered with remarkable detail. There were photos from George's first day at a new school, with Morrison standing protectively in the background. There were images from royal garden parties, state dinners, and casual family gatherings where Morrison had been present but had never expected anyone to notice his contributions. One photo that particularly touched Morrison showed him teaching George how to skip stones at a pond during a family trip to Scotland. The young prince had been struggling with the technique, and Morrison had patiently demonstrated the proper wrist motion over and over again, until George finally succeeded in making a stone skip 3 times across the water. The joy on both their faces in the photograph captured the genuine friendship that had developed between them. "You've been more than just my protection officer," George said as Morrison studied the album. "You've been my teacher, my friend, and sometimes like a second father to me. I want you to know that even though you're leaving, you'll always be part of my family." The young prince's words echoed something that Morrison had felt, but had never dared to express himself. Over the 3 years of service, he had indeed come to love George like a son, but professional boundaries had prevented him from ever acknowledging those feelings. Hearing George express similar sentiments was both healing and heartbreaking. Prince William visited Morrison personally the day before his official departure from service. The meeting was private, held in William's personal study, and lasted for over an hour. The Prince of Wales wanted to personally thank Morrison for his years of dedicated service and to assure him that his departure was viewed as an honorable decision rather than a failure of duty. "Captain Morrison," William said as they sat across from each other in comfortable leather chairs, "I want you to know how grateful Catherine and I are for the care and protection you've provided for George over these past 3 years. More than that, I want to thank you for the friendship and guidance you've given him. You've helped shape him into the compassionate young man he's becoming." Morrison felt honored by the prince's words and grateful for the respect with which he was being treated. He had worried that his resignation might be seen as abandoning his post, but the royal family had gone out of their way to frame his departure as a positive step toward recovery and future well-being. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison replied, "serving your family has been the greatest privilege of my life. Prince George is an extraordinary young man, and I have no doubt that he will grow up to be an exceptional leader. The wisdom and compassion he showed in handling my situation gives me great confidence in his future." William nodded, understanding exactly what Morrison meant. The conversation between George and his protection officer had demonstrated qualities that would serve the young prince well throughout his life, whether in personal relationships or in his future role as king. The ability to make difficult decisions with compassion, to put the well-being of others above convenience, and to handle delicate situations with grace were all essential leadership qualities that George was already beginning to display. The day of Morrison's departure arrived with a mixture of sadness and hope that permeated the entire palace. The weather seemed to reflect the emotional complexity of the day. Gray clouds covered the sky, but occasional bursts of sunlight broke through, creating patches of brightness on the palace grounds. George had woken up early that morning, knowing that this would be the last day he would see Morrison in his official capacity as his protection. Officer. Captain Morrison had completed all the necessary paperwork for his resignation and had spent the previous evening briefing his replacement, Sergeant Sarah Collins, an experienced protection officer who had been selected specifically for her ability to work well with young people. Collins had impressive credentials and came highly recommended, but everyone understood that replacing Morrison would not be easy, especially for George. The formal handover ceremony was scheduled for mid-morning, but George had requested a private moment with Morrison before the official proceedings began. The two met in the same garden where their important conversation had taken place just a week earlier. But now the atmosphere was different, filled with the weight of an ending that both had known was necessary but neither truly wanted. "Captain Morrison," George said, his voice steady despite the emotion he was feeling, "I want you to know that asking you to resign was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. But seeing you in pain every day was even harder." Morrison knelt down to George's eye level, something he had done countless times over the past 3 years when he wanted to have a serious conversation with the young prince. This time, however, the gesture felt especially poignant, as both knew it might be the last time they would interact in this familiar way. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you did took tremendous courage and wisdom. You made a decision that I couldn't make for myself, and you did it with such kindness and respect that I will never forget it. You've taught me that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is permission to take care of themselves." George reached out and hugged Morrison, a spontaneous gesture that broke through all the formal protocols that usually governed their interactions. Morrison hugged him back, feeling overwhelmed by the love and care that this remarkable young boy had shown him. In that moment, all the boundaries between prince and protection officer dissolved, leaving just two people who had grown to care deeply for each other. "I'm going to miss you so much," George whispered, his voice muffled against Morrison's shoulder. "You've been such an important part of my life, and I'm scared about how different things will be without you here." Morrison felt his own tears flowing freely now, no longer concerned about maintaining his professional composure. "I'm going to miss you too, Prince George, more than you can possibly imagine. But I want you to remember something important. I'm not disappearing from your life. I'm just going to get better so that when I see you again, I can be the friend you deserve instead of someone who's struggling to keep up." The two separated slowly, both wiping away tears but neither embarrassed by their emotional display. The genuine affection between them had been evident to everyone who had observed their relationship over the years, and this farewell only confirmed the depth of their bond. Prince William and Catherine approached from the palace, having given George and Morrison time for their private goodbye. Both parents had been moved by the relationship between their son and his protection officer, and they understood how difficult this separation would be for George. However, they were also proud of the maturity and leadership their son had displayed in handling such a complex situation. "Captain Morrison," William said as he joined the group, "we wanted to personally thank you one more time for your years of dedicated service to our family. Your commitment to George's safety and well-being has been exemplary, and your friendship with him has been a gift that we will always treasure." Catherine stepped forward with an envelope in her hands. "We have a small token of our appreciation," she said, offering the envelope to Morrison. "It's a letter of recommendation that you can use for any future endeavors, along with information about a medical program that we hope will help with your recovery." Morrison accepted the envelope with gratitude, understanding that the royal family was continuing to look after his well-being. even after his resignation. The gesture was typical of their character, thoughtful, generous, and focused on the long-term welfare of the people who served them. Sergeant Collins appeared at the designated time, approaching the group with respectful professionalism. She was a woman in her mid-30s with short brown hair and intelligent brown eyes that conveyed both competence and warmth. George studied her carefully, knowing that this person would become an important part of his daily life, even though no one could truly replace Morrison. "Your Royal Highness," Collins said, bowing slightly to George, "I'm honored to be entrusted with your protection, and I hope that we can develop a good working relationship." George responded with the polite formality he had been taught, but Morrison could see the hesitation in the young prince's eyes. The boy was clearly struggling with the transition, despite understanding its necessity. Morrison realized that he could help ease this difficulty by demonstrating his own confidence in the new arrangement. "Sergeant Collins," Morrison said, stepping forward, "Prince George is an exceptional young man who deserves the very best protection and care. I have complete confidence that you will provide both. He's intelligent, thoughtful, and remarkably mature for his age. You'll find that protecting him is not just a duty, but a privilege." Collins nodded appreciatively, understanding that Morrison was giving her valuable insight into George's character, while also showing his support for the transition. The passing of responsibility between protection officers was always delicate, but Morrison's gracious endorsement would make the process much smoother for everyone involved. George watched this exchange with interest, seeing how Morrison was working to make the transition easier for him, even in these final moments. It was yet another example of the man's selfless character and his genuine concern for George's well-being above all else. "Captain Morrison," George said formally, but with warmth in his voice, "thank you for your years of faithful service to our family. You will always have our gratitude and affection." Morrison bowed one final time to the young prince, then straightened and smiled. "It has been my honor, Your Royal Highness. Take care of yourself and remember what we talked about. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it." 6 months had passed since Captain Morrison's departure from the palace, and the changes in both his life and George's had been significant. Morrison had undergone successful shoulder surgery just 2 weeks after leaving his position, and the relief from chronic pain had been immediate and profound. The months of physical therapy that followed had been challenging, but his determination to recover completely had driven him through even the most difficult sessions. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Morrison's surgeon, had been amazed by his progress. "I've rarely seen someone so motivated during recovery," she told him during one of his final checkups. "Most patients your age take much longer to regain full mobility. But your dedication to the rehabilitation process has been exceptional." Morrison smiled at the compliment, but he knew the real source of his motivation. Every day during his recovery, he had thought about George and the courage the young prince had shown in making such a difficult decision. If a 10-year-old boy could display such wisdom and strength, Morrison was determined to show the same qualities in his own healing process. The cottage Morrison had rented in the Yorkshire countryside had provided the perfect environment for his recovery. The peaceful surroundings, fresh air, and slower pace of life had allowed him to focus entirely on regaining his health. He had rediscovered hobbies that his busy career had forced him to abandon: gardening, reading, and taking long walks through the rolling hills that reminded him of his childhood. Meanwhile, at the palace, George had been adjusting to life with Sergeant Collins as his new protection officer. The transition had been easier than expected, largely due to Collins's patient and understanding approach. She had taken time to learn about George's routines, interests, and preferences, and had gradually built her own relationship with the young prince while respecting the special place that Morrison continued to hold in his heart. Collins had proven to be an excellent choice for the position. Her background included not only extensive security training, but also experience working with children in various capacities. She understood how to maintain professional boundaries, while still providing the warmth and support that a child needed from someone who spent so much time with them. George had maintained his habit of walking in the palace gardens, though these walks now served as opportunities to get to know Collins better. She had shown genuine interest in his thoughts and observations, and had even contributed her own knowledge about the plants and wildlife they encountered during their daily tours of the grounds. Sergeant Collins, George had said during one of their walks about a month after Morrison's departure. "I want you to know that I appreciate how patient you've been with me. I know it hasn't been easy taking over from Captain Morrison, and I'm grateful for your understanding." Collins had been touched by the young prince's consideration for her feelings. "Your Royal Highness, I understand that Captain Morrison was very special to you. I'm not trying to replace him or the relationship you had with him. I'm just hoping to build something different, but equally meaningful with you." This conversation had marked a turning point in their relationship. George had realized that he didn't need to compare Collins to Morrison, or feel guilty about forming a new bond with his current protection officer. Each relationship could be valued for its own unique qualities. The palace staff had kept George informed about Morrison's progress through unofficial channels. Mary, the head housekeeper, had maintained contact with Morrison through occasional phone calls, and she regularly updated the young prince about his recovery. These updates had been a source of great comfort to George, who had worried about Morrison's well-being, despite his outward confidence that the resignation had been the right decision. Prince William and Catherine had also been pleased to hear about Morrison's successful surgery and recovery. They had sent flowers to the hospital and had made sure that Morrison knew he remained in their thoughts during his rehabilitation period. The royal family's continued concern for his welfare had meant a great deal to Morrison and had reinforced his belief that his years of service had been truly valued. As Morrison's recovery progressed, he had begun to think about his future plans. At 52 years old, he was too young to retire completely, but he was also uncertain about returning to protection work. The physical demands of the job, combined with the emotional challenge of leaving George, had made him question whether he wanted to continue in that field. One afternoon, while tending to the small garden behind his cottage, Morrison received a phone call that would change everything. It was Prince William, calling personally to check on Morrison's recovery and to discuss a proposition that the royal family had been considering. "Captain Morrison," William said, his voice warm and friendly over the phone, "I hope you don't mind my calling directly. Catherine and I have been following your recovery with great interest, and we're delighted to hear that you're doing so well." Morrison was surprised and honored by the personal call from the Prince of Wales. "Your Royal Highness, it's wonderful to hear from you. I'm doing very well, thank you. The surgery was a complete success, and I'm feeling better than I have in years." "I'm so glad to hear that," William replied. "Actually, that's partly why I'm calling. We have a proposition for you, something we've been discussing as a family, including George. We were wondering if you might be interested in a new position with us, not as a protection officer, but as a special advisor for youth development and security training." Morrison felt his heart skip a beat at the unexpected offer. "I'm not sure I understand." "Your Royal Highness." William explained that the royal family had been impressed not only by Morrison's years of dedicated service, but also by the positive influence he had had on George's development. They were interested in creating a new position that would allow Morrison to help train future protection officers who would work with young members of the royal family, while also serving as a mentor and advisor to George and his siblings as they grew older. The position would be based here at the palace, but with much more flexibility than your previous role, William continued. You'd be helping to develop training programs, mentoring new officers, and serving as a consultant on youth protection protocols. And of course, you'd have regular interaction with George, though in a different capacity than before. Morrison was overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the offer. It would allow him to return to work he loved while accommodating his health needs and maintaining his connection to the royal family. Most importantly, it would give him the opportunity to continue being part of George's life as the young prince grew and developed. 3 weeks after Prince William's phone call, Morrison found himself standing once again in the familiar surroundings of Kensington Palace, but this time as a returning friend rather than a departing employee. His recovery had been so successful that his doctor had cleared him for full activity, and the prospect of his new role as special advisor had filled him with excitement and purpose. George had been counting down the days until Morrison's return, though in his new capacity. The young prince had grown considerably during the 6 months of separation, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The experience of making such a difficult decision about Morrison's resignation, followed by the adjustment period with Sergeant Collins, had taught him valuable lessons about leadership, change, and the importance of maintaining relationships even when circumstances shifted. The reunion took place in the same garden where their goodbye had occurred, but the atmosphere was completely different now. Where there had been sadness and uncertainty before, there was now joy and anticipation for the future. Morrison looked healthier than he had in years. His posture was straight and strong, his eyes were bright and alert, and the constant tension that had marked his features during his final months as a protection officer had completely disappeared. "Captain Morrison," George called out as he saw his old friend approaching across the lawn. The young prince's face lit up with genuine happiness, and he ran toward Morrison with the enthusiasm of a child reuniting with a beloved family member. Morrison caught George in a warm embrace, marveling at how much the boy had grown in just 6 months. At nearly 11 years old now, George had gained height, and his features were beginning to show hints of the man he would someday become. But his smile was the same, bright, genuine, and full of the warmth that had made their original relationship so special. "Prince George," Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion, "look at how you've grown. You're going to be taller than me before you know it." George laughed, a sound that Morrison had missed more than he had realized. "I've missed you so much, Captain Morrison. I have so many things to tell you about what's been happening here, and I want to hear all about your recovery and your cottage in Yorkshire." The two walked together toward the palace, falling easily back into the comfortable rhythm of conversation that had characterized their relationship years earlier. However, both were aware that things were different now. Morrison was no longer George's protection officer, and their relationship could develop in new directions without the constraints of formal protocols. Sergeant Collins joined them as they approached the main entrance to the palace. Over the past 6 months, she had heard countless stories about Morrison from both George and other palace staff, and she was eager to meet the man who had clearly made such a significant impact on the young prince's life. "Captain Morrison," Collins said, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Sergeant Collins. I've heard so much about you from Prince George and everyone else here. It's an honor to finally meet you." Morrison shook her hand warmly, immediately appreciating her professional demeanor and the genuine respect in her voice. "Sergeant Collins, the honor is mine. I've heard wonderful things about the work you've been doing with Prince George. Thank you for taking such good care of him during my absence." George watched this interaction with satisfaction, pleased to see that two people who were important to him were getting along well. The young prince had worried that there might be awkwardness between Morrison and Collins, but their mutual professionalism and shared dedication to his well-being seemed to create an immediate foundation for a good working relationship. Prince William and Catherine were waiting in the palace's blue drawing room, along with Morrison's new supervisor, Director Helen Matthews, who would be overseeing the youth development and security training programs. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, with afternoon tea prepared and an air of celebration surrounding Morrison's return. "Morrison," William said, rising to greet him, "you look absolutely fantastic. Recovery has clearly been very good for you." Catherine smiled warmly as she offered Morrison a cup of tea. "We're so pleased that you've accepted this new position. George has been talking about your return for weeks, and we're all excited about the fresh perspective you'll bring to our security training programs." Director Matthews outlined Morrison's new responsibilities in more detail. He would be developing training protocols specifically designed for officers who would work with young members of the royal family, conducting regular evaluations of security procedures, and serving as a mentor for both new recruits and experienced officers who wanted to specialize in youth protection. "What makes this position unique," Matthews explained, "is that it combines your extensive experience in protection work with your demonstrated ability to build meaningful relationships with the young people you're assigned to protect. We want to incorporate those relationship-building skills into our training programs." Morrison was intrigued by the scope of his new role. It would allow him to use all of his experience while also providing opportunities for continued learning and professional growth. Most importantly, it would enable him to remain connected to the royal family while contributing to the safety and security of future generations. George had been listening to the conversation with intense interest, understanding that Morrison's new position would allow them to maintain their friendship, while also giving Morrison the flexibility he needed to take care of his health. The Bindri young prince felt proud that his difficult decision 6 months earlier had ultimately led to such a positive outcome for everyone involved. "Captain Morrison," George said during a quiet moment in the conversation, "I want you to know that I'm really proud of how you've recovered and how you're starting this new chapter in your life. I think what happened between us taught me that, sometimes when you care about someone, you have to make decisions that are hard but ultimately right." Morrison looked at George with deep admiration for the wisdom the young prince continued to display. "Prince George, you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. You gave me permission to take care of myself. Because of your courage, in making that difficult decision, I'm now healthier and happier than I've been in years. And I have the opportunity to continue serving your family in a new way." As the afternoon progressed, Morrison toured his new office space and met with various staff members who would be working with him in his advisory role. Everyone he encountered expressed genuine pleasure at his return and enthusiasm for the programs he would be developing. It was clear that his reputation for professionalism and dedication had made him widely respected throughout the palace community. The day concluded with Morrison and George taking one final walk through the palace gardens, just as they had done so many times during Morrison's years as a protection officer. However, this walk felt different, less formal, more relaxed, and filled with possibilities for the future, rather than concerns about duty and protocol. "Captain Morrison," George said as they paused by the fountain where their important conversation had taken place 6 months earlier, "I'm really glad that everything worked out the way it did. You're healthy again, you have a new job that you're excited about, and we can still be friends. I think this is exactly how things were supposed to turn out." Morrison smiled at the young prince's optimistic perspective, recognizing the emotional maturity that had made their entire journey possible. "Prince George, you taught me that sometimes the end of one chapter is really just the beginning of a better one. Thank you for having the wisdom and courage to help me turn the page."